King Arthur, Born a Legend. Fanfiction. By Cambria McClanahan. A year had passed since the sword was pulled from the stone, a year of rebuilding, of restless nights, and of a crown that felt like a stone on Arthur's brow. The weight of it was a constant, dull ache in his head, a reminder of the thousands of lives that now rested on his shoulders. The cobbled streets of Londinium, once a battleground littered with the bodies of his enemies, now bustled with a new kind of life. The air, once thick with the scent of fear and smoke, now smelled of roasting meat from the market stalls and the rich, earthy scent of a recent rain. It was a kingdom he had never planned to lead, and a destiny he was still trying to understand. Arthur, in simple leathers, often walked these streets. He did it not as a king, but as a man of the people seeking to understand the kingdom he had been thrust into. He needed to be seen as a new leader, not the person he was before, a street kid who fought his way to the top. He knew the streets well, but he needed to look at them from a different view. One afternoon, as a light rain began to fall, King Arthur walked through the city with Sir Bedivere and Goosefatbill. The trio was discussing the new trade routes, their voices a low murmur against the noise of the city, when Bedivere's eyes caught a fleeting movement in a nearby alley. A group of boys were kicking a makeshift ball, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. One of them, a slight lad with a striking gaze, moved with a grace that was both familiar and unsettling. His movements, the way he held his head, even the stubborn curl of his lip when he missed a kick, all stirred a distant memory in Bedivere. Bedivere kept this thought to himself, not thinking it important to share. The following day was similar for the three men. The air was thick with the scent of the sea and the shouts of fishermen, but Bedivere was watching for the lad. He found the group of boys on the docks, their laughter a sound of pure life against the clamor of the ships. They were playing a daring game, leaping from one moss-covered bollard to the next, a treacherous dance on the edge of the water. Bedivere watched the boy in the gray hat, his eyes following every precise, fluid movement. He tapped on Goosefatbill's shoulder. "Who does that lad remind you of?" Bedivere asked, his voice a low murmur, pointing to the small group of boys. Goosefatbill squinted. "The boy with the gray hat?" "Yes," Bedivere said. "Well," Bill began, but his words were cut off. Suddenly, one of the boys slipped on the whetstone and, with a terrified shriek, fell into the murky water. The lad in the gray hat didn't hesitate. In an instant, his boots hit the stone with a single thump, and he was gone, a blur of gray fabric and raw courage. He plunged into the cold water, swimming under the fallen boy and pushing hard upward with all his strength, lifting him high enough for the others to pull them out. As the boys were squeezing the water from their clothes, a large, hulking man pushing a heavy cart across the dock clumsily turned, his cart's wooden wheel bumping into the boy with the gray hat. The collision sent him stumbling back, slipping on the slick stone, and falling back into the water with a surprised splash. The other boys, their faces a mixture of fear and shock, quickly moved out of the way, a practiced instinct born from the harshness of the streets. The three men were walking down a narrow street, the lively sounds of the docks fading behind them. Arthur was in the middle of explaining his vision for the new trade route that would bring goods from the northern territories. He was halfway through a sentence when he noticed a stillness in his companions. He had been speaking for minutes, but he could feel that their attention had vanished. Bedivere and Goosefatbill were walking beside him, but their gazes were fixed somewhere behind him, their thoughts clearly elsewhere. Arthur's words trailed off. "Are either of you listening to a word I'm saying?" Arthur asked, his tone level but firm. Sir Bedivere and Goosefatbill startled, their heads snapping forward as if a rope had been pulled. A guilty look, quick and wordless, passed between them, the look of two men caught in a shared secret. "My apologies, sire," Bedivere said, his voice quiet, but his eyes still flickered back toward the distant clangor of the docks. "We were just distracted." Arthur stopped walking and turned to face them fully, his hands on his hips. His expression wasn't angry, but firm. "Then let's talk about what's distracting you," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I'm not just a king to be obeyed from a throne. I want to know everything that happens in my kingdom, not just the parts that concern the throne." He saw them exchange a hesitant glance, a silent debate passing between the war-worn knight and the grizzled archer. Goosetbill finally broke the silence, his voice a low grumble. "It was a young lad, sire." Bedivere thought he looked familiar. Arthur raised a brow, intrigued. He crossed his arms, leaning forward slightly. "In what way?" Bedivere stepped forward, his gaze on Arthur, his voice low as if sharing a confidence. "He was a boy from the docks. Barely more than a child, but something about the way he carried himself reminded me of you, sire. The way you were before. Stubborn, fiery." He paused, a flicker of memory in his eyes as he looked back toward the docks. "And brave, too." He went into the water without a thought, to save another boy. He didn't hesitate. Arthur was quiet for a moment, the bustling of the city fading into a quiet hum in his ears. A small, knowing smile touched his lips, a flash of the boy he used to be. The story of a brave boy from the docks, a stubborn and fiery lad, was a story he knew well. It was his own. "Then he sounds like a lad worth knowing," he said, his voice holding a hint of genuine affection. "Perhaps we should find him." "We can't, sire," Bedivere said, his tone heavy with regret. He was gone a moment later, knocked back in by a pushcart. He shook his head, looking down at his boots as if searching for a forgotten trail. He was a ghost. Arthur nodded slowly, the smile fading as his kingly demeanor returned, a solid mask of authority settling back over his face. "Then let us find him later," he said, his voice now crisp and commanding. "For now, let us return to the matter of the new trade routes." They continued their walk, but the image of the boy stayed with Bedivere, a nagging memory of a lost opportunity. Meanwhile, the boy who had been knocked back into the water was now clambering out. He was soaking wet and shivering, the water clinging to his skin like a second skin. He was small, even for a child, but his movements were precise and swift, a dancer's grace born from years of survival. He wrung out his small gray hat, its knitted wool heavy with water, and wrung out the blonde hair that stuck to his face. Then, with a practiced furtiveness, he ducked into a nearby abandoned fishing shack, its wooden planks groaning under his weight. Inside, he pulled off his sodden clothes, the dampness a cold weight on his skin. He reached for his tunic and, with a swift tug, revealed a chest bound tight with linen wraps. The waterlogged fabric clung to a body that was not a boy's, but a girl's. Her name was Lily, and she was 16 years old. She looked much younger, a fact she used to her advantage. She had perfected the walk of a boy and the swagger of a lad who had known the streets his whole life. She preferred it this way. As a young woman, people treated her with a different kind of pity or danger. They saw her as helpless, a problem. But as a boy, they saw her as a survivor. They assumed she had no problems living by herself. It was a disguise she wore every day, a second skin that kept her safe in the harsh world of the streets. Lily drifted into an exhausted sleep, the dampness of her clothes and the cold air of the shack doing little to ease her shivers. She didn't have a bed, only a tattered blanket that she wrapped herself in. The floorboards, thin and worn, groaned with every shift of the wind, but she was used to it. The night passed in a blur of fitful dreams, but her body, trained by years on the streets, woke her just as the sky began to lighten, long before the first bell of the cathedral rang. She rose silently, the floorboards groaning under her feet. The cold had settled deep into her bones, but she ignored it, pulling on a dry pair of trousers and a tunic. Before the sun's first rays could warm the docks, she was out, jogging with a fluid, practiced ease through the winding, cobblestone alleys of the village. She passed merchants setting up their stalls, the air filling with the smell of fresh bread, and fishermen preparing their boats, their voices a low murmur against the lapping of the water. They barely noticed the small, gray-clad boy, a ghost in the pre-dawn light. Her run wasn't for exercise, it was for information. She was a silent observer, a shadow that saw everything. She listened to snippets of conversation, gossip from the baker's wife about a new tax on grain, a fisherman's complaint about a poor catch that would mean a hungry week, the boast of a stable hand about a new, powerful horse at the castle. The run ended at a small, secluded inlet behind a row of abandoned warehouses. A small stream of fresh water trickled into a pool, protected from the sight and sound of the main docks. It was her own little sanctuary. She slipped into the icy water without a sound, the cold a sharp, shocking sting that stole her breath for a moment. She didn't flinch. She scrubbed away the grime of the docks, the salt from her hair, and the ache from her muscles, the cold a brutal wake-up call that sharpened her senses. A quick bath was all she could risk. The sun was a sliver on the horizon when she clambered out, shivering violently, her skin a map of goosebumps. She dried herself with a worn cloth and pulled on her clean boy's clothes, binding her chest tightly with fresh linen. The act was a familiar ritual, a shedding of oneself and a putting on of another. She put on her gray hat, pulling it low over her brow, and then was no longer Lily, but the boy from the docks once more. Her stomach rumbled, but she pushed the hunger aside. She had a purpose now. She needed to find the boys, her friends, the only people she could trust. She made her way back to the docks, scanning the bustling crowd. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and fried fish, and the shouts of vendors and the creak of ship masts filled the air. They would be here somewhere, laughing, jumping, and playing. She had a strange feeling she would see them again soon, but that she wouldn't be the only one looking for them. The trio returned to town the following day. They had one goal: finding the lad. It didn't take long. They saw him wandering in an alleyway. "Goose, that," Bill called out. The boy turned to look, his small frame tensing at the sight of the three well-dressed men, one of whom he recognized as the king himself. A tough look settled on his face, the kind he wore when a guard or a merchant was trying to run him off. He walked over slowly, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "What?" "I'm busy," he said, the words coming out as a challenge, not a question. Goosefat Bill's mouth fell open in surprise. "He's got a fire in him, that one," he muttered to Bedivere. "We have some questions for you, lad," Bedivere said, his tone gentle, trying to put the boy at ease. "Don't have time for questions," the boy replied, looking past them as if he had somewhere more important to be. Arthur stepped forward, a thoughtful look on his face. He knelt down so he was closer to the boy's level. "We saw what you did at the docks yesterday. It was a brave thing, what you did." The boy's expression didn't change, but his eyes, a remarkable gray, flickered to Arthur's face. He knew he was being studied. "Had to be done," he said simply. "What's it to you?" "My name is Arthur," the king said, his voice as steady as stone, extending a hand, not for a handshake, but as a simple, human gesture of connection. "And these are my knights, Sir Bedivere and Goosefat Bill." The boy ignored the outstretched hand. He kept his own shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond their shoulders. "People call me Jack," he replied, using the name he had chosen for his male persona, the name that was a shield. Arthur's hand dropped to his side, but he wasn't offended. Instead, a genuine smile touched his lips, a flash of a man who was used to rejection, but also knew its power. "Jack, is it? Well, Jack, we would like to know more about a boy with a mind of his own." Lily, as Jack, knew she was in a tricky position. These men were powerful, and attention from them could be dangerous, drawing the kind of scrutiny she had spent her life avoiding. She had to play the part carefully, keeping her tough exterior in place. "I don't have a mind of my own. Just doing what I have to do to get by," she said. It was a lie, but one she'd told so many times it felt like the truth, a mantra of survival. The conversation had shifted, and she could feel them trying to see through her tough exterior, to find the real person underneath. She had to end this now, before they asked a question she couldn't answer. "If that's all, I need to go. I have work to do." She turned to walk away, but a voice, calm and full of authority, stopped her. "Wait," Arthur said. "I'm offering you a job. Come to the castle. We'll feed you, give you a place to stay. You can work with the squires." Lily froze. Her mind, a constant whir of plans and survival instincts, ground to a halt. This was the most dangerous offer she could imagine. A place at the castle meant her secret would be found out within a day. But it was also an opportunity she couldn't afford to pass up. A place to sleep, food, safety. It was a risk, a leap into a terrifying unknown, but it was a chance at a life she had never even dreamed of. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the mask of Jack slipping for just a moment to reveal the girl underneath. Arthur's gaze was steady, his voice gentle and full of a profound sincerity. "Because you have a good heart," he said. "And because I think you're more than just a boy from the docks." Lily knew she was trapped. She had to accept, but she also knew she had to keep her guard up. She looked at Arthur, her eyes, once soft, now hardened into the defiant gray that he had seen on the docks. "I'll think about it," she said, her tough exterior returning with a snap. "I'll be there tomorrow if I'm not busy." She didn't wait for a reply, turning on her heel and walking away. The weight on her shoulders was new and terrifying. It wasn't the weight of a stolen loaf of bread or the fear of a guard's boot. It was the weight of a choice, a leap of faith into a world she didn't understand. Lily, as Jack, walked away from the king with a new and terrifying weight on her shoulders. Her mind, a constant whir of plans and survival instincts, was already working out the details. She had to take this chance, but she couldn't stay at the castle. Her secret would be discovered within a day. No, the plan was to get the job, stay for as long as she could, then slip away. It was a new world to learn about, full of new risks, but also new opportunities. It was a new game, and she intended to win. After a while of searching, she found the group of boys huddled together in a narrow alley, a small, grimy alcove that was their sanctuary from the world. They were sharing a small loaf of stale bread, tearing at it with their fingers. Their leader, a lanky boy with a mop of brown hair named Thomas, ran over to her, his face a mixture of worry and relief. His eyes scanned her as if to make sure she was all in one piece. "Hey, I saw that you were pushed back into the water. Are you okay?" Thomas asked, his voice full of genuine concern. He put a hand on Lily's shoulder, his brow furrowed with worry. "Yeah, I'm fine, just a little cold," she replied, her voice steady. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to ask. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about all of them. "I have a question." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. He had never heard Jack ask for anything like this. "What is it?" "The king and 2 of his knights stopped me earlier," she said, watching their faces for a reaction. "They want me to work for them at the castle." Silence. The other boys, who had been whispering over the stale bread, stopped. They stared at her, their eyes wide and their mouths slightly agape. Thomas's mouth hung open. The concept was so far beyond their reality that it was almost impossible to comprehend. "The king," he finally managed to say, his voice a disbelieving squeak. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice a little softer now. "And I didn't want to say yes unless you and the others wanted to as well." The boys all looked at each other, stunned. A job at the castle wasn't a job, it was a miracle. A warm bed, hot food, safety from the guards and the gangs. It was the stuff of legends, a fairy tale whispered in the dark alleys. "Are you serious, Jack?" Another boy, a small one named Pip, asked in a hushed voice. "The king wants us?" Lily nodded. "I told him I'd think about it. But I don't want to go without you guys. We're a team, right?" Thomas looked at the others, his face grim. He was their leader, and this was the biggest decision they had ever faced. He thought about their cold nights, their empty stomachs, the constant fear of the guards and the gangs. He looked back at Lily, at her determined, brave face, and knew she was right. They had to stick together. "We'll go," Thomas said, his voice firm, a new kind of resolve in his eyes. "We'll go to the castle." The following day, Thomas led the group up the winding road to the castle gate. Their worn boots, used to the grime of the alleys, felt small and foreign on the clean, well-tended path. The castle, a massive structure of stone and mortar, loomed over them. The guards, in polished steel and clean tunics, loomed over them, their gazes hard and suspicious as the small, ragged group approached. A small boy, a squire, with a perfectly tailored tunic and an air of arrogance, stepped forward out of the group. "Who do you think you are?" he sneered. Pip started to retort, his small frame tensing for a fight, but Thomas held a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. "The king asked our friend if he wanted to work for him," Thomas said, his own voice steady as he met the guard's gaze. "And if he wants one of us, he will get all of us." Suddenly, the heavy gate creaked open, the sound echoing in the immense space. It was Bedivere. He looked at the boys, a mixture of surprise and genuine warmth in his eyes. "Oh," he said, the word a soft exhalation of breath. "You brought your friends?" "Yes," Lily said, stepping forward. "We could find work for all of you." Bedivere started, a slight smile on his face, but Pip, emboldened by their presence, interrupted him. "How much do you pay?" Bedivere's stern expression softened into a slight smile. He let out a low chuckle, a sound that seemed to rumble against the stone walls of the gatehouse, a sound of genuine, unfeigned amusement. "A simple question," he said, stepping aside and gesturing for them to enter, "for an unsimple opportunity. You'll be paid in far more than coin, boy. You'll have a roof over your head and a meal in your belly every day. Come inside, and we'll discuss the particulars." Thomas looked at the others, a silent confirmation passing between them, before he led the group through the massive gates. The change was immediate and overwhelming. The damp, earthy scent they were used to was replaced by an air that felt different, warmer, filled with the rich smells of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the sweet perfume of beeswax candles. The sun-drenched courtyard was a world away from the grimy alleys, its cobblestones clean and its architecture grand. Their worn boots clomped on the stones, a loud, alien sound in the relative quiet of the courtyard. Noblemen and soldiers in clean tunics glanced at them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, their eyes lingering on their ragged clothes. Bedivere led them through the grand hall, its high ceilings adorned with immense banners bearing the royal crest. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast space. At the far end, seated on a simple wooden chair, was King Arthur himself. He was not wearing a crown or a king's robes, but his presence was undeniable. He held a large cup in his hand, listening intently to one of his knights, who, as they drew closer, bowed and walked away. "My king," Bedivere said, his voice echoing in the vast space, a small sound against the immense silence of the hall. "This is the group of friends who were with Jack." Arthur's gaze, sharp and assessing, swept over the small group of boys before settling on Jack. He saw the grime on their faces, the weariness in their eyes, but he also saw the unyielding fire that had driven them to his door. "Ah, Jack," he said, rising from his chair, his movement slow and deliberate, a king's grace. "I had a feeling you would bring them. Let's talk about what your jobs will be." He paused, his eyes traveling over each of their faces, a king studying his new subjects, but also a man recognizing his own past. He saw Thomas, the leader, Pip, the small one, and Jack, the boy who had come to his attention. "It seems obvious to me," Arthur said, his voice lowering with a weight of authority, the simple words carrying a monumental significance. "We will begin with night training. How does that sound?" Thomas's face showed a flicker of understanding, as if this was the only logical outcome, the natural end of their journey from the streets. Pip's eyes went wide, a spark of pure, unadulterated excitement lighting them up at the thought of a childhood dream coming true. But Jack's mind was racing, a whirlwind of doubt and anticipation, the risk of discovery clashing with the unbelievable opportunity of a life she had never dared to dream of. Arthur smiled slightly, a glint in his eye. "Now," he said, gesturing them forward, "tell me your names so I can get to know my new knights." King Arthur gestured for the group to step forward, his gaze a mix of authority and genuine curiosity. "Thomas," the leader said, his voice steady as he met the king's eyes. It was the first time he had ever spoken to a king, but he held his ground, a new kind of pride in his voice. "Pip," the small boy blurted out, a wide, genuine grin on his face. It was the first time in his life he had ever been given the chance to have a name that mattered. "Jack," the boy at the center of the exchange said, his voice quiet but clear, a solid sound in the immense hall. There was a moment of silence after Jack spoke, a quiet space in which the weight of the moment hung heavy. The remaining 4 boys followed suit, a mixture of nerves and excitement on their faces. "I'm Finn," one with freckles and a timid smile said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is Liam," he added, pointing to a taller boy with a serious expression who gave a sharp, unsmiling nod. "Owen," the next said, a stocky boy with a determined nod. And Reese, the last one finished, a boy with quick, darting eyes, who looked as if he was already planning his next escape route. Arthur looked at each of them in turn, a thoughtful expression on his face. "7 of you. A good number." He paused, his gaze returning to Jack, a knowing look in his eyes. "Night training isn't just for nobles. We have to learn to fight for what's right, and you've already shown you have the courage for that. We'll start with the basics: discipline, sword handling, and learning to read and write. But before any of that, you'll need to learn to obey orders without question. It's the most important lesson you'll ever learn." He clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and clean in the quiet hall. "Sir Gawain," he called, and a tall, formidable knight stepped forward from the shadows. His face was weathered, scarred by years of battle, but his eyes held a surprising warmth, a hint of a man who had seen it all. "You will train these boys. Start with the stables. A knight must know his mount as well as he knows his sword. Teach them to care for the horses, and they'll be ready to learn how to fight." Sir Gawain gave a curt nod. "Follow me, boys," he said, his voice a low rumble, a sound as deep as the earth. "We have a lot of work to do." He turned and began to walk toward a side door, leaving the group to stare at each other. Their faces were a mixture of disappointment and confusion. They had expected swords and armor, grand gestures of knighthood, but they were starting with mucking stalls. That night after the boys were done working, they were sent to bed. Their living quarters, a long bunk room with clean beds and soft wool blankets, were a palace compared to the cold alleyways and abandoned shacks they were used to. There was hot food waiting inside, a simple stew that smelled of roasted root vegetables and herbs. As the small group started eating, Jack slipped away. She had told Thomas she was leaving, as she normally did, but this time felt different. There was no fear of being caught, just a burning curiosity. There was so much to find. She wandered the halls for a few hours, a silent ghost in the immense castle. The stone floors were cold beneath her worn boots, and the silence was a stark contrast to the constant noise of the docks. She found herself on a quiet, upper floor, and there, at the end of a long corridor, was the door for Arthur's room. What treasures would be in there? Gold? Jewels? She slowly opened the door, a soft, slow creak in the quiet hall, worried that Arthur would be inside, but the room was empty. Jack slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her, plunging the room into shadow. The air was different here, not the stuffy smell of a crowded bunk room, but a clean, rich scent of polished wood and old parchment. The room was not what she expected. There were no chests overflowing with gold or sparkling jewels, just a simple bed, a sturdy desk covered in maps and papers, and a few bookshelves packed with thick volumes. Her eyes scanned the room, searching. A worn leather-bound book sat on a small table, filled with faded drawings of a woman with long, dark hair. She almost looked familiar. Next to it, a small wooden carving of a single raven rested on a stand. She didn't touch them, only observed, a quiet understanding dawning on her face. This was not a king's room, it was a man's. Then she saw it. Propped against a suit of armor in the corner, its hilt glinting in the faint moonlight, was a sword. It was not the great stone from which it was pulled, but it was undoubtedly the same blade. The metal of the hilt was twisted with intricate, flowing runes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the blade itself seemed to hum with a faint, silvery light. She took a step closer, captivated, a primal awe seizing her. Her fingers itched to touch the cold steel, to feel the legend for herself. Just as she was about to reach out, she heard a sound, the distant, rhythmic tread of footsteps coming down the hall. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of panic. She didn't have time to hide. She sank to the floor in front of the sword, pretending to be a boy in awe. Her eyes were fixed on the blade, the faint moonlight catching the runes, the pulsing light drawing her in. She had heard the stories her whole life of the boy who pulled the sword from the stone and became king. She just never thought she would be this close to it. The door opened. In the doorway stood a large, imposing figure, Gusat Bill, his frame filling the space, and behind him, the familiar, lean form of Bedivere. Gusat Bill let out a low, surprised grunt. "What's this?" "A mouse caught in the lion's den." His voice was a gruff whisper, his eyes narrowing as he saw the small boy crouched on the floor. Bedivere's face, however, was not angry, but a mixture of surprise and concern. He stepped past Bill, his eyes going from Jack to the sword she was transfixed by, a quiet understanding dawning on his face. "Jack, what are you doing in here? You know you're not allowed in the king's private chambers." Jack didn't turn to face them. Her voice was barely a whisper, a small, fragile sound in the immense silence of the room. I heard so many stories. I had to see if it was real." Bedivere took a step closer, his gaze softening. He knew what it was like to be a boy in awe of the legend. "The king will be returning soon," he warned gently, his voice low. "You can't be here when he does." "I know," she said, her fingers itching to touch the blade, but holding back, a quiet respect for the legend. "It's even more impressive than the stories say." Gusat Bill scoffed. He stepped forward, a shadow of a man behind Bedivere. "Impressive? It's just a sword. Now get up, boy, before the king finds you." Bedivere held up a hand, silencing him. He knelt down, his eyes meeting Jack's, a silent invitation to trust him. "What exactly were you looking for, Jack?" he asked, his voice low. "Were you looking for the man or the legend?" "Both," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. He then turned and walked out of the room, his mind still on the sword and the king. He wasn't paying attention to where he was going and bumped directly into a tall figure in the dimly lit hallway. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't mean to," Jack stammered, looking up to see King Arthur himself staring down at him, his silhouette framed by the flickering light of a distant torch. Arthur's face was unreadable, a mask of calm composure that betrayed nothing. From the doorway of the chamber, Gusat Bill let out a low whistle, and Bedivere held his breath, the air thick with tension. The king looked from Jack to the open door behind him, and then back to Jack's face. "No, you didn't," Arthur said, his voice calm, but with an edge that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He bent down slightly, bringing his eyes to Jack's level, his gaze steady and intense. "I've been told you're a curious one, Jack." Jack swallowed hard, his mind racing. He was caught. There was no hiding it now. He looked over Arthur's shoulder and saw Gusat Bill and Bedivere standing frozen in the doorway, their faces masks of concern. He was a mouse in the lion's den, and the lion had just walked in. "I didn't steal anything, sir," Jack managed to say, his voice just above a whisper, his street-smart instincts taking over, his first and only defense against authority. Arthur chuckled softly. It wasn't a sound of amusement, but of a quiet, profound understanding. "I know. If you had, Bedivere would be a very disappointed man. He has been telling me all about your little group. He says you are as loyal to your friends as you are to your heart." He straightened up, the playful tone gone, replaced by a deep seriousness. "You're a brave boy to go where you're not meant to go. You're also brave enough to be here, and to be honest. But in this life, bravery is often a test of something more. Now, tell me, why were you so eager to see a sword you could have seen tomorrow?" "I had an old friend that would tell me stories about the king and his sword," Jack said, his voice quiet, his gaze dropping to the floor. "He would tell me about knowing you, King Arthur, before you were king. How bold, strong, and how you would care for those you loved." Arthur's expression softened, a flicker of something ancient and knowing in his eyes. He slowly straightened up, his gaze never leaving Jack's face. The hallway fell silent, the only sound the distant chatter of the castle. "He told you stories about me?" Arthur asked, his voice now a low, rumbling question, stripped of all regal formality. He glanced back at Gusat Bill and Bedivere, then waved a hand, a silent command for them to leave. They exchanged a look of surprise, but they were a king's loyal subjects. They retreated into the shadows of the hall, closing the door behind them with a soft click. Arthur led Jack back into the room, standing before the large map-covered desk. The flicker of a candle was the only light, casting long shadows across the walls. "Tell me more about this friend," he said, leaning against the edge of the desk. "He knew me before I knew myself." What else did he say? Jack looked up, emboldened by the king's sincerity. He wasn't a mouse in a lion's den anymore. He was a boy talking to a man who had been just like him. "He said you were a storm," Jack said, his voice steady. "And that you had a purpose you just hadn't found yet. He said you were loyal and you cared fiercely for those you trusted." A ghost of a smile touched Arthur's lips, a distant memory in his eyes. "A storm," he mused. "That sounds about right. A storm that didn't know which way the wind was blowing." He looked at Jack with a new kind of intensity, a deep, searching look that saw beyond the boy's dirty clothes and street-smart defiance. "What was your friend's name?" "George," Jack replied. Arthur remembered what George did for him, willing to risk his life for him during the battle. Maybe George could help teach these young boys, just like George had taught Arthur.